Good morning. Of course, I'm your host, Nathan Gita, and this is Mountain Standard Time. Before we get into my opening statement, I just want to introduce who my guests are going to be. Of course, today I'll be speaking to Cliff Graydon, former member of the Legislative Assembly for Emerson, as well as Darcy Repen, the former Mayor of Telkwa and co-founder of the Rural BC Party. That'll be a little bit later in the program. I guess if we're going to start anywhere, perhaps never forget to like and subscribe the Standard on Facebook, and do try and take out a subscription on our website. We don't get any government dollars, and that's how you can support this content. I mentioned the other day that one of the most notable and growing divides within Canada is that between urban and rural Canadians. It actually mirrors very closely what's happening between Western Canada and the rest of the country, particularly the Laurentian consensus. Those people who make the decisions and those who are affected by them aren't the same in both cases. I'll give you an example. My parents live on a farm, and for a while I worked on it as the agent, mostly for sales, but also for interactions with the government. I was the guy they called. I loved dealing with the customers and the restaurants, even when they were a bit picky. But when it came to finding grants or looking up local ordinances or trying to conform to rules set by 4 different bureaucracies, it was hell. It was hell on earth. There's a half-built secondary residence on the family farm. Stop work order was put on it as it reached lockup. The regional district wants $1,500 to review the case, which is no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, the building stands empty, an unfinished home, but a complete testament to the micromanagement of authorities who never pay the consequences of their actions. But these realities in my family are just a microcosm of the wider issues. The regional district, while better than most local governments, has its hands tied by the Agricultural Land Reserve and, of course, the province. Your local municipality, of course, might genuinely care about you, but the capitals of Victoria, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Regina make their own authorities on those questions. And finally, we get to the scope of Western Canada. From pipelines to environment, from the approval of large-scale developments to cross-border trade deals, the West is dependent on the people in Ottawa actually giving a damn about them. And the people in Canada's capital and their friends from Toronto to Montreal get paid, regardless of the situation west of Lakehead. Our political class has become completely detached from the ramifications of its own ideology. The COVID pandemic has exposed this best. No one got a vote on whether or not they were an essential or non-essential worker, but the layoffs broke mostly along class lines, and with those who were already doing well on the upper end of the spectrum, doing better, because now they didn't have to drive to work. There were a whole bunch of write-offs for having a home office. That's another debate for another time. But for right now, it's clear that those who do the ruling and those who are being ruled are clearly not on the same page. What needs to change in order for us to overcome that? Perhaps voting reform, perhaps land reform, perhaps salaries for politicians to be tied to the mean income of Canadians, perhaps a hard talk with Ottawa or even sovereignty. It's hard to know. But for some illumination on questions of urban versus rural and the West versus the rest, as well as just what it's like to come up in the world and have helped build it. We're going to turn now to Cliff Graydon. Cliff, welcome to Mountain Standard Time. It's great to have you on.
It's my pleasure, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that the best place to start is just your own background. How did you kind of see the world growing up, and then what did you do to make your way forward? Where were the places you visited? I know that you were a Boilermaker for your career, for most of your career. Tell us a little bit about that. What was the raising you had, and how did that shape your worldview?
Well, just to begin with, I started out just as a poor little country farmer boy. And I learned one lesson from my father. We were picking stones one day. I said to him, why do we not move back to where we were flooded out to in 1950? And he said, picking stones builds character. And he raised 4 characters. I'm just one of them. And you'll have to put up with it. At any rate, as I left home, left the farm, I worked on both railroads in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, and then went to British Columbia because I had a grandfather and a grandmother out there and an uncle, who my uncle was a founding member of the Boilermakers. And I became a Boilermaker apprentice. But as a pre-apprentice, I worked in Hudson Hope, as some of you in British Columbia would know where that is, the Bennett Dam. However, I had the opportunity of getting my Boilermakers card in British Columbia. I worked in many, many, many different places in British Columbia. And at the same time, I got the opportunity to work in all of Western Canada and part of Eastern Canada and some in the United States. And I got to see, and at the same time, while I was going through apprenticeship school, I didn't have any money, so I bought a tow truck to help put myself through school, because you learn as a farmer son, you learn to support yourself. And I also then bought into a tow truck, or to a trucking business in Vancouver as I was doing my apprenticeship and working, because Boilermakers don't work full time. Any rate, from there, from British Columbia, my father was on the farm and not doing well health-wise, and he needed help. And so I came back to Manitoba, and then eventually took over the farm. And as being having a lot of experience all over the country, then you take a look at what's happening locally and you voice your opinion. And that's what led to getting involved in different farm organizations, being appointed to boards, whether it was on a grain elevator or grain company board or whatever. And then I became a local counselor on the local RM. And you speak up for the people that elected you. And then after that 6 years that I was on there, and the things that I learned, I was involved in different things that, because we saw the expansion of agriculture, but was being dumped on by environmentalists. And today, even today, agriculture is being ridiculed by environmentalists, and yet they do it with a full stomach and a full mouth. And they expect you should be able to produce all of this for next to nothing, but it does cost money to produce. And the environment is very, very important. It's very important to agriculture. It's important to the people that live in the rural area, whether it's in rural BC, or if it's in rural Saskatchewan, Alberta, or Ontario for that matter. It doesn't matter where. The environment is very, very important to you. One of the things that is, it's a fake tax, is the carbon tax. That is a fake tax. And quite frankly, we need to compete in the world with what we produce here. But we have to build our country, and we have to expand and exploit our natural resources. So, and along the road, one day someone said, the MLA has retired, and we want you to run. Of course, 4 other people wanted the job too. And I hadn't given it any thought for myself. I had actually been supporting someone who had left the province because of the provincial government he had been working for. He left the province and went to work in Alberta. At any rate, he encouraged me, and finally I did say okay, and I did become an MLA for 13 years. But the environment has been important all the way along the road, whether it was when I worked in British Columbia or when I worked in Saskatchewan, Alberta, wherever. So that's just a kind of a short overview of where I started, and I still do farming, and a certain amount of farming in between sitting around reading newspapers.
Well, and we're happy to have you on this newspaper today. Well, our broadcast that's affiliated, obviously, and directly affiliated with the Western Standard. I think that maybe something to kind of give people an idea of just how far and how much could be done by one person I mean, you had listed for me a little bit earlier the various projects you worked on. Can you give us that list in a bit more detail? Maybe even explaining how you got into some of those jobs. Especially your time in British Columbia. That you as a boilermaker, you were at both mills and at dam sites. How did that feel being a part of these projects? That I mean, they're still standing today. I can still visit the place that you helped build.
It was actually very, very good. You met a lot of people, but you also learned how they existed where they were, and some of them people hadn't traveled very far from where they were born and so on. But to see how Prince George was developed, for example, that was quite something. I was there when they built the first pulp mill. I worked on that. And at that time, I made fun of people that had left Kansas City to come and live north of Prince George, where they could actually claim a quarter section of land and move on there. And a lot of us young men that were working in Prince George laughed at these people as they came up the highway in convoys and homesteaded a quarter section, not thinking farther ahead that we were building the pulp mill and they were going to clear their land and make money, and they became great citizens there and great people to work with. You learned a lot of different things working in places like that. In Quesnel was the same, building a mill there, and I worked in Kitimat, worked in Terrace, and some people have said, and I have said it often, that Rupert may not be at the end of the world, but you can see it from there, from Prince Rupert.
True. Yeah.
It's true, but worked in Fort St. John and Dawson, and yes, I also worked in Squamish, and was gassed there at a chemical plant. Woke up in the hospital. Those kind of things do happen. I worked in a place called Wood Fiber, where a boiler had blown up. It was something to see, and how the people around there had survived, because even though it did happen in their area. Lots of good experiences. Worked on Vancouver Island in different places. Jordan River, I built the penstock there to the powerhouse, and that's the southern tip of the island. I don't know if you know that, but it's the southern tip, and there's actually below the 49th parallel there. A lot of good people there, and at the time, Victoria was a place for the newlyweds and nearly deads. It has changed a lot since then too, but that was the term that we used for Victoria. So yes, and I worked in Skookumchuck and Kitimat, Kamloops, and pretty much all over the place, as well as having a sideline business, because you don't work full time all the time, but I get to meet so many good people, great people in rural area. But in Vancouver, you would run into a different situation. They didn't understand. They didn't understand what it takes to build a province. They didn't understand what the basis of their province was. And so that industry would a lot of times get penalized by the politics of the province. And unfortunate, they paid the price in a lot of cases. And it turned out it's the same in pretty well every province. But we need to build our country, and we need to develop our natural resources to be able to compete in the world. And we also need to look at our immigration policy, which doesn't exist anymore. And not that I'm opposed to immigration at all, and I'm not a racist in any respect. I grew up beside an Indian reserve, and when we did a DNA we were closer than we thought. At the same time, I forget what year it was, but there were 10 families of us after I came back to farm that sponsored a family from Vietnam in Canada. Great people, hard workers, and they paid attention to our laws and our rules. I'm not saying that they gave up anything that they believed in. They didn't have to, but they were hard workers, and yes, two of them started businesses after they came here. So there's a lot of things that you learn as you work around the country, and then when you come back and you've got your own business that you have to make money at and make a living at, and then have people that don't understand it, you have to stand up for yourself. And you're finding that out as well on your own farm or your parents' farm.
Yeah, sometimes it's a real fight. I mean, I value the fact that I think this actually goes back to Barrett's government in British Columbia. That would be the NDP government that broke up the social credit government for one term. And so they brought in the ALR to try and ensure that there would always be farmland and arable land. And I want there to be arable land, and I don't want there to be condos built, especially in the Fraser Valley, all over the place. It's some of the best growing land in this country. But at the same time, up here in Prince George, I mean, I'm not building a secondary residence to run an Airbnb that's, 80 miles from the airport. Like, that's not what's happening. Like, I just need a secondary residence. The amount of laws and ordinances that surround that, it's a lot. I think coming back to rural issues, maybe you can talk a little bit about, everybody would probably think, most people would think, if you're thinking about Manitoba, hey, Manitoba, it's a rural province, it's a western province, it's got lots of farming going on, it has entire cultures based around farming. My mother's Mennonite. I know there's a strong Mennonite community inside of Manitoba and others as well, farming based. How could there be any difficulties for rural Manitobans in this area? I mean, it sounds like the kind of province where they can just, anybody can farm anything and things can go really well. What's the specific problems, difficulties, challenges faced by people in Manitoba when it comes to rural issues?
Well, I'll give you one issue that was that I was really involved in. One of them was the expansion of the hog industry in Manitoba. And at the time, we had an NDP government, but we also had two companies. One of them was a very large company to begin with, McLean's, but the other was just a family in rural Manitoba in a place called the Brokery, the Vielfier family, and one partner by the name of Jansen started a company, and it was called High Tech at the time, and now it is High Life. And it's a very, very, very large company, which has been sold, but it still operates in Manitoba. But at the time, the NDP said we were polluting everything. And because at that time I was involved locally on a council, and also with a small organization in southeastern Manitoba. And we tried to explain to them that we weren't polluting water with agriculture. We weren't polluting the Red River, or as they said, damaging Lake Winnipeg, blah, blah, blah. And it was quite a battle. And finally, we just did take water samples everywhere to prove that we weren't, and to let that business build. And today, it's one of the biggest employers in the province of Manitoba, is the hog industry, because now you have your slaughter plants and so on and so forth. But one of the biggest polluters to the lake yet today is the city of Winnipeg. Their sewer if there's a half an inch of rain in the summertime, a lot of their sewers carry both rainwater and sewer in the same pipe, only at a different level. And if you get a half an inch of rain, it just washes it all into the Assiniboine River and the Red River, which end up in Lake Winnipeg. The north end of Winnipeg, they've been talking now for forever about building a big plant there. But this is the first year that a government, the provincial government, has said that they will put some money forward to that. But the city of Winnipeg doesn't know where they'll get their money to protect our lakes. That agriculture has been, over the years, has been accused of doing that. So those are the kind of things that do hurt agriculture. And today in the Free Press, for example, the Minister of Conservation, and I'll try and quote it, and I'll probably have to read it, says that the transportation and agricultural sectors remain the largest contributors in the province to greenhouse gas emissions. That's from the Minister of Conservation. Get serious. She's saying that with a full mouth. She's eating 3 meals a day, has no idea what we do in agriculture, and at the same time, the cattle industry doesn't contribute, but actually helps sequester the carbon. The grain growing out there sequesters it. Why do they not measure that as well? And because of my father had farmed all his life, he farmed through what they called the dirty 30s in the prairies, when the climate was dry, terribly, terribly dry. Then I think about now what they do in a little place called Roland, just here in southern Manitoba. They're digging up dinosaurs. Where did they come from? And who changed the climate so bad that they got buried? Get serious. We need to address the environment. Yes, we have to protect it, but at the same time, use some common sense and listening to Trudeau. I can't call him Trudeau on this, can I? But at the same time, listening to him suggest that the carbon tax is going to lower the carbon emissions, and then he's going to give you the money back. Hello. Get serious. I can see where development into electricity, and Manitoba has a clean electricity. We actually sell electricity to Minnesota and to the States, and it ties in. And I see again today in the paper where the United States and Canada are in a discussion over importing electricity from Canada. But I know in Alberta, you'll take a company like Suncor has invested in a electric plant, and Alberta really does need that. Wind power takes a lot of steel to build one tower. A lot. How do you get that steel? You're just going to go out and pick it up on the ground? No, you've got a lot of stuff to do to create that, to build it. And if you were on a respirator today suffering from COVID, would you only want wind power to supply the electricity? Hello. It doesn't blow every day. And how do you store it? And to build batteries you have to mine. So there's a lot more to this environment and carbon tax hoax than what most people know.
I think that a lot of people inside of, well, within anywhere, it's just a bit of ignorance around the whole thing. As soon as you've been off the farm for a few generations, or you've just never had a family member who had that kind of line of work, or there's a lot of professionals in your family, even if they're not doctors and lawyers or teachers or accountants and that sort of thing. And it just, nobody has a family farm lying around, or there's just Uncle Joe 2 provinces over. He's a carpenter, so that's the last guy that works with his hands. Everybody else in your family is doing tertiary jobs, right? Service industry jobs or professional work. There's just a disconnect, and I think that's what happens in a lot of urban centers. Is that a lot of urban reality is like there used to be more working class jobs, and when we had more manufacturing in this country, you could actually bump into someone who actually worked with their hands for a living. Nowadays, right, there's the contractors, and then there are various laborers who are always kind of moving around the city doing what they're doing, and everybody else in a shiny office building, they don't really get to do that. Do you think that some of that's the disconnect? There's a cultural disconnect between the people who get the benefits of the work and the people actually doing the work?
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge disconnect, and you've hit the nail on the head in that respect as well. Because at one time, a lot of the immigrants, and Mennonites are part of that, when they came to Canada, they farmed. They worked with their hands, and they raised their families on the farms. Today, our farms are much larger in size, but with a lot less young people involved in it. And another thing that I think that people don't understand is, or don't pay attention to, and maybe you don't even know about, but they like to say that Alberta is polluting the world with their oil industry. And yet, Quebec, where does it get a big portion of its oil? Saudi Arabia. Oh, yes. And
Very
how do they
progressive place. Very
exactly?
progressive.
How do they go about getting that? Do they use coal? Yes, they do. Yes. And I have a brother that's a Boilermaker that's worked all over the world, and he now lives in Africa and is semi-retired basically, but at the same time has built coal-fired boilers in different parts of the world in the last few years. You see Germany now doing that, and China is still building coal-fired boilers. And yet we are not supposed to be able to use our natural resources. And the people that have elected the Liberal government today, that is actually, in my mind, ruining Western Canada. The people that have elected them don't know where their energy comes from. They don't care because they have a disconnect with the environment totally. Only thing they'll listen to is the crap that the media carries. And the media has been bought and paid for by this Liberal government that's in place today. That's unfortunate. The socialism is ruining our country. I strongly, strongly support the whole country. I don't want to see Western Canada or Western Canada being Manitoba West break out of Canada. I don't want to see that happen. We have a great country. We need to appreciate what we got and understand how we got it, but at least develop it. There should be a pipeline going to Eastern Canada. I've helped get the pipelines through Manitoba, and in fact worked with Enbridge in order to get the pipeline across the border in Emerson before the opposition in Minnesota knew that the pipeline was even going to be there. We see people that live off, with their hands out, give me, give me, give me, but they don't have any blisters or calluses on their hands. That's unfortunate.
Deeply unfortunate. Deeply unfortunate. I think there is that disconnect between the reality of how it takes, how the sausage gets made, and then who's eating the sausage. Right? It's this thing. I don't want to know how it's being made. I just like the end product, right? And it's tough work. It's tough work to get these things done. Let's talk a little bit about your time in the legislature proper. So you're elected to that big, beautiful building in Winnipeg. I actually think it is one of the more beautiful legislatures we have throughout the country, let alone Western Canada. The Tyndall Stone and everything else. Of course, it's also a gigantic Masonic temple, but that's a different question altogether. The point being that it's a very cool building. I got a tour of it while I was there by a buddy who was working with the premier at the time, and it is this kind of testament to what's happening throughout the province of Manitoba. You were elected there. You guys sit in a semicircle, which is a little different than the parliamentary tradition that we're used to otherwise. And what was your time like there? You've been there, I think, in opposition and then as well as in majority. What was it like to be a part of a movement in Manitoba, and did that movement achieve what you wanted to achieve?
It was a bit of a challenge, to say the least, because when you're working in your own business, you make the decisions and you live with them and you get it done. And when you're elected, you have to work with a lot of people with different ideas and define what your decisions are going to be and what your projects are. And then it just takes too damn long to get it done, in my mind. But at the same time, it is the way that the legislatures work. And yes, we did accomplish a lot of things. Even when you're in opposition, you can accomplish certain things. But it does take a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that. But part of it, one of the big parts is to be able to educate the total population in the province. So as a rural MLA, you have a big chore to educate those that have that disconnect, as you pointed out, from the rural area in order to move ahead with things. And then, of course, we also have the same situation that British Columbia has with our Aboriginal population, and their how should I say it? It's not just claims; they do own a lot of land, and then you need to cross that land with certain things. And Manitoba was, for example, is to bring our power from our dams in northern Manitoba down to southern Manitoba. And you have to cross different reserves and so on and so forth. And the NDP, rather than to deal with each Aboriginal tribe, decided we're going to circumvent that and go a different way. And they built this bipole 3 at an extra cost of $5 billion. At whose expense? At the people of Manitoba's expense. It runs all around the doggone province and back to Winnipeg. But nobody you can't tap into those kind of powers until after it's gone through your station. So it's going to take years for Manitobans to pay for that. And we couldn't stop that when we got elected. That was something that we were going to stop, but we couldn't. And that, well, I don't know, it's disappointing that you can't do that, but there's too much money put into it in order to stop it. So there's other things that I brought up myself. I suggested that I had a program that I was working on to stop the switch. I don't know whether you've heard of it or not, but switching from daylight savings to
That's right. Yeah.
standard back and forth. It was called Stop the Switch was my project. And the reason for it was so many people suffer health issues when the switch is made, whether it's in the spring or in the fall. So many people suffer. And there's a group of people, and when I say a group, there's an age group that don't suffer. And so then they want to golf and they want to do this and they want to do that, but they don't understand what effect this switch has on people. And I wanted the government, our government, to have a referendum on it. And they refused that. And I'm a conservative through and through, but they refused to even debate it in the legislature. Although I brought forward a private member's bill to do that, they refused to debate that. And so I talked to some individuals since I've been out of the legislature, and they said, well, I wouldn't mind if it was on daylight savings time all the time. I said, then why didn't you support it when you had the opportunity? And yes, well, no, the boss said you can't support any of that. Those are the kind of things that I found to be very frustrating when you're not going to take a look at what's happening to the people. And it's not just in Manitoba, it's in every province. It's not just in Canada. The European Union took a vote and said, we're going to quit switching. So now what we want is we want the government to mandate you have to get up 1 hour earlier for the summer so you can stay up 1 hour longer golfing. And it doesn't matter how that affects your grandmother and grandfather. That's very frustrating. But there were some good things. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, learning that statistic in like Law 12, which is over 10 years ago for me now, the end of high school, that the amount of crashes that happen right after the time switch is astronomical. And there's visits to the heart attack for emergency, and it's really rough on the body. They say that about swing shifts, right? Like if you wanna take years off your life, do swing shifts. Now those who have to do swing shifts, all we can do is pray for them. But it is nasty. You're gonna do 4 nights and then 4 days and 4 nights and 4 days. Like it's hard on you. And now you're doing that to an entire population one time, twice a year. An hour this way, an hour that way. It's predictable. It's predictable that would have adverse health effects. So, there was this journey through the legislature, your representation in legislature, advocating for rural Manitobans. Did you find that your party, the Progressive Conservative Party, was more amenable to rural Manitobans, or did you find that there was just as much resistance from them as there had been from the NDP when you were in opposition?
I found that they were very amenable until after we formed government.
An old problem.
Because once we formed government and we had the largest majority in the history of Manitoba when we formed government. And, but to maintain that, you have to, I gotta think of the terminology that's appropriate to say it this time, but basically you have to bend over to the people, the urban people, because they were the ones that were holding the NDP in government. And quite frankly, even though I haven't been in British Columbia for a number of years, I would say that's the only reason that the NDP are in there is because of the urban population.
You're not wrong. Yep.
And unfortunately, when you start to look at, well, I've got to maintain our position here. You got there to do a job, do the job. Do the job, do the things you said you were going to do. Manitoba is one of the only provinces that I'm aware of, there might be others, that have a school tax on agricultural land.
Yeah, we don't have one in BC. It's suspended. So you look at after you declare yourself a farmer, all of a sudden your land tax worth is like. And
yes, well, in Manitoba, our land tax is very, very high. The education tax on land is very, very high. And we had said in opposition that we were going to get rid of it. 5 years later, now in this particular legislature today, they said that they are now going to lower the education tax on farmland, or on property, 25%. I'm not opposed to paying education tax on my residence. That's where I raised my family. That's where the educators or the education tax should be on. But in the province of Manitoba right now, I see the NDP are beating up the premier because the education tax at 25% reduction puts $4,000 in his pocket this year on his particular residence in Winnipeg. But at any rate, they say they're going to lower it by 50%. Well, we also have something else that other provinces don't have. We have an employee tax. So if you employ X number of people, then you have to pay a payroll tax. None of the other provinces west of us have that. That's unfortunate. There were people that all of a sudden have built up a business and find out that they're paying a payroll tax. And that payroll tax was brought in by the NDP government at one time for a certain purpose, but now it goes into general revenue. Why do we want to discourage people from building a business here with this unnecessary tax? So, yes, there's lots of things that I was disappointed in after we formed government, that we didn't pay attention to what we said we were going to do. At any rate, yes, going forward, well, even, and I just want to go back a little bit. There was things that you could do. You could bring in private members' bills. And I brought in one in Manitoba to honor the RCMP. And I don't know if you know the history of the RCMP, and but they started out as the Northwest Mounted Police.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1920, the federal government formed them with Eastern Police, formed the Northwest Mounted Police and the Eastern Police into the RCMP. And the Northwest Mounted Police actually started in Manitoba. At any rate, after some of the things that have happened to the RCMP, and it happens to other police forces too, but I thought you look in the mirror and you see that red light, what's the first thing that goes through your mind? You look at your speedometer and say, where the heck did he come from? But at the same time, if somebody's breaking into your house, then who do you call? And we know that a number of the RCMP were shot. Their families go through something every day that our families don't have to go through. When the RCMP member goes to work, is he coming home? So I felt it was important to honor them with the RCMP Day, the day that they were formed. And so I put forward a private member's bill, which passed in the legislature. Those kind of things I think are important to recognize the people that do things that normally we take for granted. You take for granted that you're protected all the time. We should not take those kind of things for granted.
No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't. It's a rarity in this world, actually. There's very few places where you don't have to give your police bribes or to feel like you need to be armed at all times in order to protect yourself. I'm not saying I'm against self-armament whatsoever. I'm very pro having armaments and being able to defend yourself. But nonetheless, the point that I'm trying to draw here, to your point, Cliff, is that, of course, we need to honor those who put their lives on the line every day, first responders, military, of course, our police. I think that maybe the way we can kind of round out what we've been talking about here, we've been talking about this divide, the West and the rest. We've been talking about the divide within rural and urban, even in a place like Manitoba, again, a place where most people would think, no, that's still a rural province. It's like Saskatchewan, the farmers have the say. And you're explaining to me in no uncertain terms, like, well, no, actually, Winnipeg is kind of pulling all the strings around here nowadays. Let's talk a little bit about what the future then holds, but for Manitoba and for Canada in general. What's going to happen here? How does the Premier of Manitoba or the premiers of the rest of the Western provinces, how do they get either more out of Ottawa, or how do they lead as a group in order to ensure their own populations are better taken care of?
Well, I think they have to stand together, first of all. And I am disappointed in one respect that the Premier of Manitoba didn't stand up with Scott Moe and Kenny and Ontario, when they were fighting the federal government on the carbon tax initially. And but in Manitoba, our Premier and I was sitting in the government at the time, and he said, we're going to have a carbon tax here. And I said, no. And I said it in caucus. I said it privately to him, and because the people in rural Manitoba that elected me were saying the same thing. Now, apparently, well, then he changed his mind afterwards, but in the meantime, didn't step up at the time. And now he is still saying, well, we've got our own, what do they call it? The clean green machine that they've got here. And they're going to court on that with Trudeau, with the federal government. But we do need to also explain or how do you go about saying it? Because we have a lot of people from Eastern Canada that have come to work in Western Canada, because that's where the jobs were in Harper's days. Alberta had many people from New Brunswick and from Newfoundland and from Ontario working in the oil patch. They've gone home and they're not working. Or some of them are working in the oil patch in the ocean, on the floating drillers there. But at the same time, we have seen a lot of Western Canada money go down east and transfer money. And Manitoba is not one of them. Manitoba is actually one of the highest tax provinces in Canada. And they have benefited from transfer money from the federal government, but not at the same level that Quebec has benefited from it, or even Ontario. We have to start working as a country, working for the benefit of every province, not taking from one province and giving it to another. And stay out of the way for provinces to develop their resources. Manitoba does have some oil drilling going on in western Manitoba. And we have mining opportunities in northern Manitoba. In fact, we have some of the ingredients for batteries, a fairly large deposit of that. Saskatchewan could be doing more work with nuclear. And nuclear energy is another fairly clean energy. I worked on nuclear boilers as well in the United States and in Ontario. We can develop some of this stuff, but we need to do it as a country for the benefit of all the people, not just a certain handful that's going to support a socialist government.
It's a strong statement, but I think a necessary one. And the fact of the matter is that our country, it has lacked vision for a long time. And without a new vision or a concrete vision forward, which I think is something that's cost the Conservatives a lot of elections myself, we're not going to get anywhere. Just as kind of a final thought, Cliff, if you could give one piece of advice to people who are aspiring to be MLAs, councillors, even perhaps MPs, even the Prime Minister of Canada someday, premiers of provinces, mayors of towns, what would you tell them? If they want to lead their people, what's the best advice you could give them?
Pay attention to what is beneficial to your area that you can contribute to your country. And if you're going to be the Prime Minister, you need to be able to promote your country, not your own ass. And that's what he has been doing. He's been trying to buy a seat for that. And I shouldn't have said in that respect, but he's been trying to buy a spot for himself and his foundation. He's never had to work for a living. You need people that have worked, and many of the politicians have. I'm not suggesting that being a lawyer isn't work, or you don't have to work with your hands as I have done, and as many other people have, but you need to be able to say, yes, this is what my work history has shown me. You don't take something like this playboy that paid $2.5 million to keep some young lady in BC quiet, and then he was a snowmobiler and blah blah blah, and he took advice from his father, who made Canada #1 with his fingers stuck up in the air. That's what he did to Western Canada.
Mm-hmm.
That is not building the country. And we have a reputation as being an open country. And this guy is ruining that, and he's ruining it for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have respect of other countries that we do business with, that we ship our whatever we produce here. I don't care whether it's oil, whether it's mining, whether it's agriculture, whatever we produce. We need to be able to stay in the world market. And right now we've been made a fool of by this individual that is leading the country. and by some of the premiers in the past too, have done that to us. So you have to look at how you can compete in the world with respect from the rest of the world. That's important in my mind.
I completely agree, and have pride in one's own country. Absolutely. And I know that you are very proud of Manitoba, proud of the place you came from, proud of the things you accomplished. And we're proud to have you on here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Cliff.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope I didn't embarrass you with my language.
Nope, not at all. Not at all. Thank you so much. We hope to have you on again soon.
We'll look forward to it. Thank you again, and keep up the good work. And the young man that works with you, I have a lot of respect for him. There's no reason why he can't be the Premier of British Columbia at some time.
There you go. We'll take care of him for you. Don't you worry. Thank you so much, Cliff. Well, we'll be bringing on Darcy Repen right away. He, of course, is the co-founder of the Rural Party of British Columbia and the former mayor of Telkwa. Darcy, are you there? Let's see.
I am. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you founded the Rural BC Party, and what kind of the purpose is and what you're hoping to accomplish?
Sure. Well, first of all, good morning, Nathan, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, the politics didn't come to me intentionally. I initially got involved because of issues that were happening here in Telkwa that I was concerned about, and a number of other people were concerned about. And so it really began with my term as mayor of Telkwa. I didn't seek re-election, partially because I wanted to focus more on rural BC issues, provincial level issues, and even to an extent federal level issues. And so at the time I was considering this project, I realized there were some other regional politicians that were pretty fed up with the way our region in particular was being handled by the provincial government. And so, ultimately we got together and had a chat about the best way forward, and determined that forming a province-wide rural party, one that targeted rural areas and emphasized the need for equity for rural British Columbians, was the best way forward. So, Jonathan Van Barneveld, again, a very successful local politician in Houston, BC, and myself and a couple of other people that we've been working with really got together and said, we need to present some solid policy that shows people in rural BC that there's another way forward besides the urban-centric parties that currently rule the roost. And of course, we know that the urban areas will still be that target. Our belief is that for us, if we can take seats in the rural areas, we'll have a disproportionately loud voice in the legislature, just because of the shakeup that would be, and what it would show our Victoria politicians, how rural people are feeling about the treatment, and also the potential of rural areas that is really being overlooked. And it's easy to take a negative route and look at the problems that we have in terms of funding and infrastructure development and managing the revenues from our resources. But really what it's about is having a positive projection of what rural BC can look like in the future. And that's the thing that gets me excited about what we're working on.
It's funny because I've always lived in Prince George, except for my brief time down in Vancouver, and I was in Langley, to be honest, about for my schooling. I went to Trinity Western University in Langley, but the thing that kind of comes to my mind is that when it comes to these rural areas, they do just get completely ignored. Now, I mean, maybe people out in Telkwa don't feel that people here in Prince George have a lot of solidarity with them. I mean, we've got too many Starbucks and we've got some of the big box stores. We're not exactly, Hudson's Hope, But at the same time, obviously, people live in Prince George in order to experience the outdoors and to be, to get to hunt, and they enjoy being here instead of being in the long commute of the Lower Mainland and the various, bumper to bumper traffic that happens there. And we have more similar concerns to you than we do to the rest of the Lower Mainland, that sort of thing. I think that there still is that feeling of disconnect, though, between, smaller rural areas, slightly larger rural areas, and then actual cities or towns, and then, of course, the metropolitan areas down south. How do we make a connection between places like Prince George and Telkwa?
I think that connection's already been made, Nathan. To be honest with you, I don't think that disconnect exists because the people that live in the smaller areas recognize the importance of places like Prince George and Terrace in our connectivity with the world, right? So Prince George is our medical hub for much of the work that people need done with their healthcare for our area. And also Terrace factors strongly in that. In terms of trips out of town, shopping, different appointments, often those are also hubs that we're engaged with. And so, again, it's not an us versus thing scenario. And I'd like to make that clear right off the bat, is that the Rural BC Party is not anti-urban by any means. In fact, we believe that what we're proposing will be hugely helpful to the urban areas that are really under a massive amount of stress because of the population growth and the challenges that they're having with accommodating people, both in terms of housing and work that pays a living wage. So, really, yes, there's a lot of variation within our region, not just between Telkwa and Prince George, but really, you could look at Telkwa and Taylor, BC. Taylor is a very similar sized community, incredibly different situation, different politics going on there, different level of needs, different flat out municipal wealth level. But we recognize that, if you take a 60,000-foot view, really all of us that are outside of those major core urban areas, and most specifically the Greater Vancouver and Southwest Vancouver Island area, are the ones that are truly in a different world. And, perhaps Kelowna is starting to bridge that a little bit as well as it becomes more urban. But, really, we believe that if our government was taking rural development seriously and really investing in us in terms of economic diversification and a greater level of sustainability and development, and really taking a close and accurate look at what the funding levels look like in terms of infrastructure investment, in terms of resource revenues, and generally in terms of investing in the social and cultural baseline for these communities, is, to me, it's the reasonable thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. And I believe that when they do that, they'll see that they need to increase the investment in rural BC, but that investment will pay much more dividend than a similar amount of money invested in our urban areas. And there's one very clear and simple example that I use for that, and that's the proposed elementary school that they're looking at putting in right downtown Vancouver. Smithers is building a new elementary school as well right now. And there are some differences in design. The one in Vancouver will have residential space above it, slightly different number of classrooms and kids accommodated in the school, and both facilities have childcare involved. But the bottom line is you can take those two budgets and you can look at them and go, what's going on here and what's going on in terms of the cost? And the bottom line, there's no brainer. It is far more cost efficient for the government to invest in building these sorts of facilities and housing in rural BC than it is in downtown Vancouver. And so if you're looking at bang for your buck, again, we don't want everybody from Vancouver to move to rural BC. It's impractical. It's not going to happen. It's used as often a boogeyman argument by people that say, hey, like, we love our lifestyle. We don't want to have everybody moving here. It's not going to happen. But if we saw a 1% annual increase in migration to rural BC, really, we'd barely notice it in terms of livability, but it would create a massive boom in terms of housing, employment, infrastructure development. The fact that we can actually have other businesses that forever have only been able to operate in the urban areas can now set up quite comfortably and actually do business as efficiently or more efficiently in, say, the Highway 16 corridor with our rail route and our access to the port and our fiber optic internet. There's just no reason anymore to lean on that historical excuse of, well, Darcy, people historically have moved to the urban areas. Great. Historically, there was no internet, right? This has revolutionized our world. So every time someone brings that argument up to me about why rural BC is dead in the water and is just going to slowly, fade away, I just go, no, actually, it's going to go the other way. And you guys are behind the curve, because we now have everything that we need to do exactly what you're doing in Vancouver, cheaper, better, faster, more efficiently. And what we need is the government to recognize and support that.
Those are, they're incredible points. I wouldn't excuse any of them or go against any of them. It's absolutely true that the infrastructure here in northern British Columbia, it's far superior than what it was even 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And now there's a way forward in that sense. If there is a place for not necessarily counter argument, but maybe those unintended consequences of population change or increase, but there are other macroeconomic factors that are around this. Is that, one of the things we talk about on the show at every now and again, or I bring it up as a refrain, is that, I remember when $400,000 was a doctor's house. Now in Prince George, people want that for a BC bungalow. Now, let's be clear. I love BC bungalows. They were pretty okay, well built, depending on how fast they were put together. Their split levels are very simple. If the roof line's angled enough and you got shingles, it's something you can do yourself later. And if they've been renovated on the inside, they're not a bad looking house. Like, that's fine. But $400,000 on whatever that is, 0.3 of an acre, I don't know, is a lot. Let alone the taxes that happen here in Prince George. I don't know if you guys are experiencing that further west, or if housing prices are just going up everywhere, or it's just everybody from Vancouver moving to Prince George. But it's getting to a point where people cannot get into a decent house, even if they have, like a government job and a decent down payment.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, it is happening further west. I believe Smithers and Telkwa actually had the highest property value increases this year. And Telkwa's average property value, I believe, is either just below or just slightly higher than Prince George's. So the issue there is not people leaving the city and migrating to rural areas, in my opinion. The issue there is our failure to develop a building code and a construction industry that can meet the demand that we have for housing. I'm not even going to use the word affordable. I'm just going to say housing in general. And it's been an ongoing frustration for me going back to when I was mayor of Telkwa, that we haven't been able to be more proactive in going, look, we can build houses that meet the requirements of our climate and of our living conditions more affordably than we are right now. And Nathan, part of the reason that those housing prices are so high is that when you look at the actual cost of construction now, even in rural and northern BC, I believe you're looking at, for a high quality house, between $250 and $300 per square foot. So when people are comparing single family homes that are already existing and constructed versus buying and building a new home on a lot, even at $400,000 or $450,000, really you're probably still getting better bang for your buck with older houses. My feeling is that we need to drive those construction costs down. I am absolutely an optimist and someone who believes so much in our ability to create as a species. And already we're seeing some really interesting innovations, things like 3D printed homes. We're seeing new techniques for building highly efficient and even net zero buildings. What we need, again, is a very clear roadmap And I'm not anti-publicization of different industries, to be clear. But I believe that one way or the other, whether it's through private industry or through a public construction entity, we need to get more efficient and more cost efficient at building housing. And when we get there, it will still be cheaper to build in rural areas because the land is here. And the opportunity to upgrade and redo infrastructure, water and sewer systems is going to be far, far cheaper and easier to deal with than it is to dig up Broadway Street in Vancouver, right?
That's true, yeah.
And the other thing is that many of the towns in BC, so Prince George is seeing a boom. Smithers and Telkwa are seeing a boom. Terrace and Kitimat obviously are in another boom, which for them is, I think, getting a little tiring for the people that live there because it's boom, it's bust, it's boom, it's bust. Prince Rupert is kind of doing what it's been doing. All the other small towns in our region actually haven't seen a large shift in housing prices or in migration. And I can tell you right now, I grew up in Mackenzie, BC. There's a lot of perfectly fine empty homes in Mackenzie, BC, which is a fantastic place to live, especially if you're lifestyle oriented and you're into fishing and hunting and hiking and beautiful mountain views out of your window. Yes, is it a little bit of a dated layout? I mean, it's a company town that was built in the 1970s. But, my belief is that if you have a community that galvanizes around something and wants to promote it, that you can make things that might look pretty dated look pretty amazing. And there's a benefit to Mackenzie's layout as well with the density in terms of maintaining their infrastructure that, again, will be much more cost effective than it would be in the Lower Mainland. So there's some missed opportunities right now. There is housing available in rural BC. It's just maybe not in the places where the demand is. But again, even for Prince George, yes, those housing prices are up high right now. But if we were to see a depreciation in the cost of new building, I think everything would sort of stabilize on that level.
We, of course, don't wish negative equity on anyone. It's not something you want to wish on anybody, but it's one of those funny things. When you're a renter, you don't think being a landlord's a job, and when you're a property owner, you don't want to see values go down. It's an old adversarial problem. But I think the kind of coming back to the general idea of rural BC and some of the divides that are found there, at least between us and especially the metropolitan areas in the Lower Mainland, is throughout this show today, we've been talking a little bit about the fact that it very much mirrors the kind of Western alienation concept. So we have a comment here from Aaron Ekman, of course, friend of the show. I know he's a friend of yours as well. And he's just making the point that, there's a concept of Western alienation. Has the rural BC party debated Wexit internally? Maybe that's a little bit on the nose, but the idea just in general that if this is the debate going on in the rural BC party, that of course the metropolitan areas aren't really paying attention to us. What about that larger scope question? Do we have an answer to, should Victoria and the rest of BC not be, maybe the same place anymore, or Vancouver and the rest of the mainland, and for that matter, the rest of the West and even Ottawa somehow go their separate ways or find some new political arrangements?
I can tell you that it hasn't factored in our party policy, and I can answer the question very upfront for myself, and the answer is no. I love BC. I've lived in Vancouver. I've lived in Victoria. I'm not a person who believes that the way forward is to go, hey, we should just cut ties. I am about solutions, and I absolutely believe that within BC, there are solutions, and I'm working on them. And I believe that we're seeing progress. ICBC is an example. It's an incredibly frustrating and long and difficult slog. But if you are able to present a clear case backed by data showing that there is a clear and obvious disparity, my optimistic feeling is that when you bring that in a cohesive manner to the government, that they'll listen to you and they'll correct those issues. And so that's kind of my approach. I mean, I just think the grass is always greener, and I couldn't fathom a Wexit scenario involving BC. I think that, again, when we talk about differences, especially politically and lifestyle-wise, British Columbia as a whole is quite different than Alberta. And I think Alberta is quite different than Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I've worked in all these places, right? I'm familiar with them. And I appreciate all of them and what Canada brings as a whole. And to be honest with you, I appreciate what our international neighbors bring as a whole as well. I mean, on that level, I think that we have one globe that we're all living on, and that we need to, instead of living in fear of our neighbors and always fighting and trying to figure out how to get the best of another entity, that we actually go like, what's the real goal here? And that's for all of us to have a fulfilling and high quality standard of living. And I believe that's attainable, but we need to take a different approach that is much more problem solving oriented. And so, yeah, you know what? I honestly think Wexit is a no-go in BC. I know that I got more votes than all of the Wexit candidates combined in the last election. And I think the reason for that is that I made it very clear that actually I'm very progressive and problem-solving oriented, rather than sort of stuck on the things that are wrong. That I need to bring forward solutions to things, and I think the people take an interest in that. So, yeah, Wexit, no go for me.
That's not a problem at all. I mean, on the show, I've been rather ambivalent about this. Obviously, the Western Standard has a pretty hard sovereignist line, and they prefer to be called sovereignists over separatists.
Right.
I for myself am just interested in a better arrangement politically. So problem solving is another way of putting that. Maybe I would put it more cynically, because I'm obviously just on the more tragic conservative side of the spectrum. But the other side of it is that it definitely, in my mind, is like, I don't want to see the borders of Canada change. I have put it as maybe some of those internal borders should change. I have advocated in the past, for example, that we should follow the diocesan lines, or maybe something else. But the point is that would give us at least 47 districts. And actually, to the point of having, we had Cliff Graydon on earlier, so we were talking about Manitoba. Well, I've been up to Churchill, Manitoba a few times now, and I can tell you the people in Churchill, Manitoba feel far more connected to the people in Nunavut than they do to the people in Winnipeg. And so maybe those borders in that sense should change, some of those provincial lines. Coming back to the rural BC question, what kind of political arrangements might find some of that innovation? Would you, for example, be in favor of, I don't know, a provincial senate, or somehow the regional districts getting kind of a say as legislation comes out of Victoria? The various regional districts have a say in things, or local candidates somehow have a way of influencing that in a secondary fashion. I don't know if it's a second chamber or how it works, but something like that.
I struggle with it a little bit, because what we see so often in rural BC in these small municipalities is a lot of candidates elected by acclamation. And we see a lot of sort of municipal gridlock. People are stuck in their own municipal bubble of dealing with the day-to-day issues that they're trying to address for their constituents. And the reality is that in all of those communities, it's a part-time job. When I was mayor, much to my wife's chagrin, kind of called it mayor school, and actually left my previous career to really dedicate myself for those 4 years. Now, the unfortunate part of it is that combined my regional district director salary and mayor salary was under 20 grand a year. So I gave up about $500,000 over 4 years to serve my community, and that hurt. And that was definitely part of the factor of me stepping away from that. But the other thing is that by stepping away from it, I can actually dedicate that kind of focus. So, honestly, I think you're going to be challenged in a parliamentary level in addressing this. I think that the best way forward for people in rural BC is not going to think that they're going to get better representation in Victoria. And there's a very good argument for that, which is that most people feel that a vote should be equal to another vote. And we already have some problems with that in Canada, the Senate. I think we can circle back to your Western alienation a bit later and talk about some of the things that drive that, fall into the same category. So again, my feeling is that we need to provide the evidence and the proof that we are not being treated equitably, and that comes down a lot of the times to math. That's what I've done with ICBC through a series of Freedom of Information reports, and today is actually a very it's a huge day for me, because today is the day that ICBC has as a deadline to respond to the first information request in their rate requirements proceeding. And so that issue is now plainly on the table, and we will see what their response is. And I've also engaged with our local MLA, Nathan Cullen, and he also is paying close attention. I've also reached out now to Adam Olsen and to Sonia Furstenau as well. So people are apprised of the issue, and now it's kind of the ball's in their court, and we have to see whether they're going to do the right thing or whether they're going to dig in and quite clearly just say you're second-class citizens. So it's a start. It's the approach that I'm taking. In terms of representation in the legislature, again, I think if we flat out are able to elect representatives in the rural areas, in those 24, 25 ridings that would, I think, be very interested in that kind of representation. Number one, there's a chance that we would hold the balance of power in the legislature. We saw that with 3 seats with the Greens. And the other one is even just breaking in. We know historically how hard it has been for a party to elect representatives. It took the Greens, I don't know how many elections. And, I was on the radio with Stuart Parker the other day, and one of the things that he remarked on was, first election, I wasn't even here. I was in the Northwest Territories during the last election, spent $0 on signs or radio ads or TV ads, participated remotely in the debates, and got almost 11% of the vote. I mean, I put pennies on the dollar what we put into the campaign compared to the other candidates, and 11% of the vote came. So to me, I look at it and I go, there's clearly a strong interest. And one of the things I've always said too is that my biggest job isn't during election campaigns. I may never run again, and that would be perfectly fine with me, because I'm all about policy. I'm not about the politics. I'm not about smiling for the cameras or cutting ribbons. I think that we can do better, and that's where my focus is. So we're certainly working on that for the next campaign, and hopefully we can find compelling candidates throughout the province that people engage with and go, yeah, like this is a problem that we need to see addressed. And by electing people to the Rural BC Party, we can start to address them and at least shine a real light in the legislature on what's going on.
I think that, speaking of shining that light in the legislature, I mean, there are things that affect rural British Columbians that simply don't affect urban British Columbians. I was just bringing this up again just a little bit earlier with Cliff. I was talking about all the ordinances and the incredible amount of red tape that comes around for those of us in especially in farming communities, or just in rural parts of the province that have a little bit more acreage that does qualify under the ALR or as farmland or whatever. The idea of trying to build a secondary residence and having generational farming, all the stuff, you'd think that they'd want to facilitate this, but the amount of red tape that's around it is incredible. What are some of those key planks in the Rural BC Party platform that address some of those issues, not just about of people who are farming and whatever, that's very important, but of other rural issues? What does that look like?
Well, again, it looks like drafting policy that addresses it. I agree with you, Nathan. I am a hugely passionate advocate of agriculture in Northwestern BC. I'm a co-founder of a cooperative, the Coast Field and Forest Cooperative, that has been engaged in trying to get funding for a agricultural research center in our region. The ALC is a dumpster fire. It has been a dumpster fire for decades. It's an absolute embarrassment, and it is totally stunning to watch the decisions that they make time and time again. I mean, you probably know of the Lately Tenay decision on their wanting to access the lake there for a rehabilitation center, and the ALC saying no on their own territory. It's insane to see some of the decisions that are happening. So I certainly support, and I know that our regional district board, specifically Mark Parker is the chair and Mark Fisher is a grower here in my area, have been doing incredible work putting pressure on the provincial government on some of these issues, particularly the overruling of local boards, local commission boards, which is, whenever that happens, everybody's jaw drops and just goes, what? Wait a second, a guy who's not a farmer, who's in Victoria, is telling the people that are farmers up in northern BC that they're making the wrong decision on agricultural proposals.
I have to interject here with just a story to this effect. Now, admittedly, it wasn't the ALC that's bad enough. It was BC Assessment, and it's one of the reasons why I grind an axe against those guys every day. Again, BC Assessment, if you're listening, no one decides what my house is worth except for the person who pays for it. That's it. And the bank, I guess, when they want to do the equity backdoor thing, whatever, to keep the economy spinning, because we want all these spinning plates to keep doing what they're doing, whatever, right? The point being that the BC Assessment was trying to tax my parents' property as their backfield to the second section. They're trying to tax it as lakeside residential to a lake with no public access except the ancient public access that's an overgrown goat trail, and no utilities and no buildings. And then all their examples were literally like from Ena Lake. They were all from these little residential places that are, like cabins on a lake. So that's all that. And then they're comparing it to this 160 acre that's next to this tiny little lake that doesn't have any utilities. I'm just saying that, like, did somebody call this in on a Friday? Like, really? Like, Friday afternoon, it was already halfway through happy hour and they just punched this up and threw it up on the website for their response to my challenge. It's like, this is nonsense. It's like, who is running this thing?
So, and this is the problem, right? Is that we leave these decisions to individual bureaucrats that absolutely that Friday, and they've already mailed it in, and they're like, I'm gonna look at lakeside properties today and do it, and then they end up getting backed by their superiors, or they get it sent off without having that actually even being looked at. And I hear those complaints time and time again from people living here, and it's whether it's BC Assessment, whether it's how they're being managed by the health system, whether it's EI issues. I mean, it's just income tax problems over and over again. And I kind of cheekily put something out there a couple of years ago when I was kind of a peak frustration, going, really what I basically said, here's my resume. I would like to be a service tester. I'd like to be the person that goes and tests all government services and tells you whether they're garbage or whether they're working. Because with my experience, I'd say literally the majority of the government services that I've tried to access have been absolute garbage. And it's not because anybody's intentionally, again, it's Hanlon's razor, right? Like, we're not talking about people that are intentionally going, we're just going to be annoying to people today. But through this incredible bureaucracy, in the end, that's exactly what the result is. And, again, I often joke that the only place, if you ever want to revisit the 70s or the 80s and hear a busy signal, the only place that you can do that is to call the Canada Revenue Agency.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So, yeah, it's really, the ALC is just another example of that. Now, it's great to see, and, sometimes you have to acknowledge the positives as well as keep pushing on the things that need change. I think so much pressure was put on the NDP government because of the issues with housing on agricultural land that they did finally announce, and we don't know exactly what it'll look like, that they were going to relax the restrictions on that. Now, for me, I always think, there's a way to do this more in a more sophisticated manner so that they can achieve the objective that they were trying to achieve the first time around, but also recognize, as you said, generational farming opportunities, or even, one of the things that I'm a big advocate of is getting a more intensive agricultural industry going in our little pocket here, where we have in places a very beneficial climate and a ton of water. So as we see the challenges that the Central Valley of of California is experiencing with their drought, my feeling is that we can supplant a lot of that supply by developing the agricultural industry in the right parts of BC, especially with climate change coming on, because we have water, and water when you're growing intensive vegetables and fruits is the key. So yeah, I think it's a long haul. I don't really want to see agricultural land protection lifted entirely. But again, I think one of the key things for me, and again with the rural BC party as a whole, is that we're huge advocates of candidate independence, and that candidates need to bring ideas for their region to the table first. Not the party's ideals, but they need to go into their region and go, this is an issue that people in our riding, our consensus feeling needs to be addressed, that they know that the NDP or the Liberals are not going to take seriously in Victoria, and that our candidates bring those issues forward first and foremost. So yeah, agriculture is going to be a huge one. How we're managing our forest industry and appurtenancy and tenure, huge. How we're dealing with oil and gas, some of the other mega projects. Site C is one that has been on my radar. We have to look at the 60,000 foot view and go, where are we going here? Like, what is this going to look like as a region in 30 or 40 years, particularly if there is increasing international pressure for us to develop, to either take in more people or to develop and extract more resources to feed that international demand.
The international demand. I mean, this is another part of this whole question of what development in northern British Columbia looks like, not just with a face towards Asia or with the rest of Canada through the port, right? Because the trains go both ways, but even internally, there is that divide even within rural areas. It's interesting to have this interaction with you, Darcy, because it's interesting to see like a truly rural progressive, somebody wants to innovate here at home and everything else, and I do as well. We might differ in some of those respects. But I think that this is another question. So are we looking at that international scope? Is that the future for the rural areas of British Columbia through the Highway 16 corridor, like that face to Asia, that pivot to Asia? This is where our international market is. This is how we will be able to facilitate growth in our region. And I know that there's on another side, there's people are like, well, again, that maybe it is a bit of NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard, but there's a lot of people are also like, well, I'm more interested in the conservation aspect of what being in the rural part of British Columbia comes from. Do you think there's a way to reconcile that development and the conservational kind of idea, the economy and the environment? These questions are often paired against each other. What does the rural BC party have to say to this?
Absolutely, there's a way forward and to reconcile those. And again, I spend a lot of time trying to put forward a perspective that shows both our obligation and how we can move forward and reconcile our demands and obligation to participate in the international markets with creating stability in our economy and our livability here at home. Industry is one impact, housing is one impact. I think that the biggest challenge is that we have a historical wrong that needs to be addressed, and that is how the First Nations people in our region were basically stripped of their land base and went through historically a very challenging, well, understatement, say challenging, devastating period of time. And so there's an obligation to address that, and land rights are first and foremost in that. We know that where I live, the Wet'suwet'en negotiations, as much as they're far too opaque and secretive for my liking, I believe everybody that lives in a region has a right to know what's going on. We all know that coming out of that, much like the Lake Babine Nation Agreement just north of us, where they gained control of 20,000 hectares of land there, we're going to see a similar settlement here. And so again, for me, it's about getting ahead of the curve. But I also remind people that people in rural BC are disproportionately enormous consumers of goods and materials. we consume more in terms of, you know, what we buy, what we shop, how much fuel we burn, the heating of our houses, the size of our houses, all of that on a global level. And so I am vehemently opposed to the not in my backyard approach. I am 100% behind doing development that is sustainable and responsible. And if we're not going to publicize any of our industrial entities, which, as I've said before, I believe is something that Norway has done very well with and is now incredibly, their sovereign wealth fund has something like $250,000 per person in Norway available because of the way that they've managed to, you know, take public ownership of many of their resource industries and the companies doing that extraction. All that being said, either way, the companies that are doing the extraction need to be held to account to do it in a sustainable way that isn't going to leave an extraordinarily negative impact. I think part of that is to take that 60,000 foot view and get ahead of the curve in picking the areas and the resources that we know exist. We know where most of the resources exist in BC. And to get ahead of the curve and go, okay, these are the areas that we are going to get ahead of the curve in supporting. That will streamline the permitting process. It will make it where, you know, hopefully a lot of the conflict will go away when there's consensus agreement that this is the right place to do these kinds of developments, whether it's forestry or mining or oil and gas extraction. And then just do it and go, we're going to do this and we're going to make sure that we retain as much of the benefits and the revenue for the people that are here. But to be honest with you, Nathan, I don't see, because of the volatility of the international markets, I don't see that as the be all and end all as we move forward. I think the key is that we need, number one, I mean, agriculture is far more stable and more important because people will always eat. And the demand for quality food from an area like BC is only going to increase. There's no way that people go, oh, yeah, whatever, you know, we're just going to eat Spam that's made in a lab. They're going to want our food. They're going to want our water. And so we have a choice. We can either ignore that and just, you know, twiddle our thumbs, and what's going to happen. And I think the vice president of the US kind of said something that I've been saying for years last week. She said, you know, we fought a lot of wars over oil, and everybody caught that part of her discussion, said, wow, she's admitting that they've been engaged in wars over oil. But the next thing she said was, we can expect that that's going to happen for water. People didn't catch that. But what she's saying is that water is the new oil, and they are very aware of their food supply in the United States, and they supply us. The Central Valley of California exports far more food to Canada and Canada exports down to the US. So we better take notice when the Vice President of the United States is making a statement like that, and realize that either they're going to come and get our water so they can grow our food for us, or we better start growing some food. And again, in terms of that international obligation, yep, we should grow lots of food so that we can sell it to the people in California. And that's kind of my approach is, you know, we need to maximize the value of what we have here and make sure that we're doing it in a stable and sustainable way. And I don't believe in, you know, I think we've seen some really tragic situations where corporations have kind of milked the resource and then left the taxpayer hanging. I'm currently involved in a remediation or looking at remediation work in the Northwest Territories in Giant Mine Zone. And yeah, it's when you look at the cost of these cleanups, it's a big challenge. And much like Mount Poly, I mean, how the taxpayers got that bill hung on them is beyond me.
Let's talk just a little bit here about the challenge that you're putting forward to ICBC. What does that look like? Take us through this. What went wrong when it came to rural residents and ICBC rates, and what are you hoping to put right?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story that began when I was still Mayor of Telkwa, and actually the wife of one of our councillors showed up in a meeting and said, "We just got our insurance. We want to know why we're paying more than Smithers." And I kind of went, "What?" I had no idea. And then realized that the dividing line, the territorial rate dividing line, is in between Telkwa and Smithers, which on a basic level is clearly, totally ridiculous because everybody in Telkwa drives in Smithers. We worked with trying to move that with ICBC and just kind of got a very apathetic, "Yeah, we see what you're saying and you're right, but we're not changing it." So that frustrated me, and I began doing more research after we kind of got that response. And they did say, we're doing a 10-year adjustment that's going to make some difference to the different territories, but it really didn't address that. So I started taking a look for myself at some of the data that ICBC had online and realized, I'm a bit of a math junkie and data junkie. Numbers are interesting to me. So I'm looking at this data and my eyeballs just about popped out when I saw the disparity in accidents and injuries in Greater Vancouver and the collision rates at certain intersections compared to where I was living. And so I did some quick math and went, wow, we are paying way more than we should be given what we would be getting back in claims. This led to an initial FOI campaign where of course, there's a 3-hour limit on what they'll do for free. And I knew that if I put the whole thing in myself, they'd send me a bill for $10,000 and say, pay up or you get nothing. So I took a more creative approach and I recruited a whole bunch of people from throughout rural BC and said, I'd like you to put forward this FOI request, all prepared, and I kept a spreadsheet to track which postal codes, and each person submitted an FOI for a rural postal code and an urban postal code. Got those initial 20-something requests, tallied it up and went, yep, there you go. There is the issue. And so what it was, Nathan, is over 5 years, we got the totals of how much people were paying in from different postal codes and premiums, and we got the total of how much was paid out in claims. And for example, the B6B postal code in downtown Vancouver was actually being subsidized, not even counting operating costs, subsidized by over $20 million a year the last couple of years of that setup, and overall we're subsidized. By comparison, places like Telkwa and Smithers were paying up to 2.7 times as much for every dollar coming out in claims. So the next step, I took that to our neighbors in Houston, to their council, and asked if they would sponsor a resolution at the Union of BC Municipalities, which they did. And that resolution was endorsed by the executive, at which point that opened the door for me to then do an FOI for all of the postal codes, because then you can say it's in the public interest. So I did that. ICBC digging in, it's amazing. On each level, I had to involve the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner because ICBC just would not release the data. And in fact, that first set with the individual people asking for it, they actually put a threat in the response saying that they can't share that information with other people. And so the first respondents, when they got it, called me and said, I don't think I can give this to you. And I was like, it's a freedom of information request. And so we tried to pin ICBC down on it. They just, it was a mistake. It's like, how do you put a threat at the top of an information report, freedom of information report, and then say it was just an error? It was totally bizarre, but that's what they did. And so finally we got all the information, I guess probably about 3 weeks ago, and I crunched those numbers. And yeah, the bottom line is there's no question that the people in rural BC overall are paying about $1.85 for every dollar that comes back. $1.84 for every dollar that comes back in claims. And the people in the urban areas, those two rate territories of Southern Vancouver Island and Vancouver, are paying about $1.35. So we're paying 49 cents more for every dollar that comes back in claims. So today, I asked some questions in the first Freedom of Information request with ICBC. Today is the day that they'll have a response to that. And I'll put forward my final arguments, but I also certainly expect that our rural representatives in Victoria, regardless of whether they're NDP or Liberal or Green, support their own constituents in fixing this, and not fixing it over 10 years and not fixing it partially, but right now, fix it. We should not be paying more for every dollar that we get back in claims than someone in downtown Vancouver. And another point to that is when we've got this green or clean BC initiative, how does that work when you're subsidizing people in downtown Vancouver to insure their cars? It's totally counterproductive to what you're trying to accomplish with your clean BC initiative. So we'll see what happens. I don't expect that I'm going to get a response saying, whoops, we made a mistake, we're going to fix it all now. But I think that we're making progress in shining a light on what exactly is going on. And in terms of the solutions, sorry, you asked about that. There's a couple of simple solutions. One is break rural BC into a separate pool. And rural BC now is very comparable in population to what the initial ICBC pool was. So there shouldn't really be a logistical issue with that it's a big enough entity. It's a million people. Or the other one is that they've demonstrated that they can break data down by postal code. And so I think that's actually the best way, is to do a prorated 5-year average per postal code and go, you're going to pay the rate that your postal code is paying. And we're going to balance the books on that level. And it's totally doable. It's just a question of whether the political will is there to fix it and whether ICBC can get their bureaucratic butt in order and actually do it, execute it.
It's an ongoing question, isn't it? Whether we're talking about the ALC or we're talking about ICBC or we're talking about BC assessment. It's interesting how many arm's length agencies in this province, or BC Hydro for that matter, or BC Ferries, how many arm's length industries in this province are, well, some of them are woefully mismanaged. A lot of them are just mismanaged, but they hurt real people through their mismanagement. With respect to that, then it's funny that you brought up the postal code thing. So I want to just kind of give that a bit more of a spin. It's interesting, the idea of breaking things down by postal code. I think that's a right way of doing things. But then again, we're coming back to a question of localism, coming back to a question of place. We're not talking about rootless cosmopolitanism, which is something that at least people on my side often accuse people down in the Lower Mainland of, to a certain extent. How do we bridge that gap? How do we find, is there a progressive argument from your point of view for localism that isn't just cosmopolitan, trying to find solidarity all across the board, trying to find a solidarity in a locale and build out from there?
I don't think that it's a progressive argument. It's a logical argument. And the answer is this: they are already doing it. ICBC already has rate territories. There's already localism. They have it built into their system. They've had it built into their system for a very long time. And they adjust their rates based on some magical formula that obviously doesn't work correctly for those rate territories. So really, it's not a question of localism or progressivism. It's a question of going, you can do this better. ICBC can have a better system, and the system that they have right now, and certainly one of the key questions from my information request was, provide the breakdown of your algorithm of how you calculate rates. I want to see that, because it doesn't calculate the rates fairly for people in rural areas. So that's basically where that focus is for me, is to go, let's get the information, get a response that goes, this is how we do it. And then I go back into it and I go, well, this is where it's wrong. And again, it's not about localism. We're not saying, hey, people in Telkwa should pay a different rate. And again, I'm perfectly fine. Part of the reason that I broke all those pools down was to go, if ICBC just wanted to go with the rural pool, here's what it looks like. And I actually did a separate pool that took in Prince George, Kelowna, Kamloops, Nanaimo, places that are currently in rural rate territories, to go, what's their rates? And collectively, they were much closer to the urban pool. However, for NCLGA, I broke out Prince George alone and went, that's interesting. Prince George is an outlier. You're actually closer to our rate level. So, I'm doing this off the side of my desk, right? I have a full-time job and I'm able to calculate this stuff out. So surely some of those $250,000 a year bureaucrats at ICBC should be able to do better than me. And if they can't, then I'm willing to come and work for substantially less than $250,000 a year and do the work that they can't do, I guess.
And isn't that just the question? Again, whether we're talking about the managers, the endless stream of management that appears to be in Northern Health or in any of our municipalities, and at least if they're big enough, and certainly within our arm's length organizations, this does seem to be the problem. I just want to cue in just one last time then into what rural BC, the rural BC party is, if there's another election tomorrow and suddenly all those seats that you had targeted are yours. There's 25 seats in your hand, and there is a minority legislature. What would be the first thing on your agenda?
Well, the first thing on our agenda would be to push the government to create a Ministry of Rural Development. If you want to go, okay, like what's the number one step forward to actually start addressing these issues? You need to have people that are focused on addressing these issues. And that ministry, in my opinion, in the party's opinion, should be located in Prince George, not in Victoria. So that is a pretty clear and easily addressable step. I was shocked that the government didn't form a standalone Ministry of Rural Development after the last election, given the report from John Horgan's former deputy premier suggesting that would be a good idea, and also from John Horgan's own statements after the election when he said we have to do better in rural BC. And yet here we are, and that's not happening to my knowledge or by appearances. And then going beyond that step, we have a list of things that involve healthcare, education funding, ICBC, infrastructure, revenue sharing. These are all different things that we've already identified that need to be looked into. We need to do the studies and assess the data and establish where we're standing. And then we need equity. And that is a big part of it. And then for certain things, we've talked a bit about agriculture. When we talk about healthcare, we know that you're not going to have equal healthcare in every place. Telkwa is not going to have a St. Paul's hospital, but we need to actually figure out a better way to address the disadvantage of not having that, because the reality is that people in rural BC actually pay more in taxes than the people in the urban areas. And in a way, that's good fortune. That means that on average, we have a higher overall average income, but that's not even evenly distributed. And so there are many people that you and I both know are really struggling in rural BC that then when they have to take a trip to Vancouver and they need support from a spouse or whatever it is, and they end up out of pocket for whether it's accommodations or travel or all these different things. Meanwhile, someone in Vancouver just catches a bus, right? So we need
or the SkyTrain, yeah.
That's it. So, or the $1.7 billion SkyTrain, right? And we can have a whole other show on infrastructure, Nathan. But really, what it is we need to start looking at the details. And I continuously feel like our government is just completely stuck in a rut of trying to do surgery with a bread knife. And we need to start getting out the scalpel and doing the details on how we manage our province. And I think you'll see a lot of benefit for the urban areas once we do that as well. It's not just all about, the rural BC areas getting a raw deal. I know that's not the case, but we need to do better across the board. And I believe that we'll benefit from it, and the urban areas will benefit from it, and the province as a whole will be stronger and in a better position to move forward into the future.
Well, that I think is an excellent resolution for any party and for anyone who lives in British Columbia or in any of their local districts. I think it's very important that we feel a sense of belonging, and I think it's very important that we feel a sense of loyalty and for that matter, the sense that the future could be brighter if only we did the work today. I think that's all very good. Thank you for that inspiration, Darcy.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Nathan. And
absolutely.
the conversation.
Yep. No, we've been happy to have you on. Again, I do hope we get to have you on again soon. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Awesome. Thanks again, and enjoy your afternoon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, that's been our show then today. We had, of course, Cliff Graydon on, and we had Darcy Repen on. And we talked a lot about those rural issues and that divide that's there between our rural parts of the country and our more urban parts of the country, which in my opinion still very much reflects the Western versus the rest divide when it comes to Canada, particularly our constant battle with Ottawa. In any case, I'm just thankful for your views. I'm thankful for your comments throughout the show. Sorry about the sound earlier. We got that sorted out eventually. And just stay tuned. We'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific or Mountain Standard Time.